The moment my son opened his Christmas present, his tiny hands trembling with excitement, my mother smiled. But when he pulled off the wrapping paper and found nothing inside, she laughed. The sound of it, light, almost musical, sent a wave of cold fury down my spine. My 6-year-old son, Ethan, stood motionless, his small fingers still gripping the empty box as if he had somehow missed the real gift hidden inside. His brown eyes, filled with innocence and hope just seconds ago, clouded over with confusion. Then, hurt. Then, something that shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces, shame. The room fell eerily silent. My siblings and their perfect little families shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their designer outfits shimmering under the chandelier's glow. My father, Charles Whitmore, swirled his scotch lazily in his glass, refusing to meet my gaze. My mother, Eleanor, tilted her head, an amused smirk dancing at the corners of her lips. "Oh, don't look at me like that, Lauren," she said lightly, her manicured fingers adjusting the pearl necklace resting against her cashmere sweater. "He doesn't need anything, does he? Besides, it builds character." A slow, creeping rage coiled inside me. Ethan blinked rapidly, his tiny frame trembling as he tried to fight back tears. My husband, Daniel, stiffened beside me, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might break a tooth. I felt my own hands curl into fists beneath the table, my nails digging into my palms hard enough to leave marks. It took every ounce of restraint in my body not to lunge across the table and wipe that smug expression off my mother's face. But instead, I did something far more dangerous. I smiled. Not a warm, forgiving smile. No, this was something sharper. Colder. A silent promise. "Thank you, Mother," I said, my voice smooth, almost serene. I stood slowly, pushing my chair back with deliberate care. The weight of my son's pain settled deep into my bones, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt before. I reached down, scooped Ethan into my arms, and pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Let's go, sweetheart." Michael followed without a word, his silence carrying the same dangerous edge as mine. The room remained frozen, a sea of guilt-ridden expressions and stunned whispers. My siblings, Olivia, Charlotte, Henry, all avoided eye contact. Somewhere in the distance, the grand piano continued playing soft holiday tunes, mockingly cheerful. As I walked out of that house, into the cold winter air, I made a vow. They would pay for this. And by the time I was done, my parents, the ever-so-powerful Whitmores, would learn the hard way that when you humiliate a child, you destroy a family. 3 days earlier. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the windows of our modest colonial-style home, their delicate patterns melting as they touched the warm glass. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air, mingling with the comforting aroma of hot cocoa. The Christmas tree in the corner stood at a respectable 6 feet, decorated with handmade ornaments and twinkling lights that cast a soft glow over the living room. It wasn't grand, it wasn't extravagant, but it was ours. And it was filled with love. I watched as Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully tying a ribbon around a small gift box. His red sweater, his favorite one, the one he had picked out himself from Target, hung slightly loose on his tiny frame. His brown eyes shone with excitement as he held up the finished package. "Mom, do you think Grandma and Grandpa will like this?" he asked eagerly. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. Inside the box was a simple yet thoughtful gift, a handmade ornament he had painted in school, decorated with tiny gold stars. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't designer. But it was made with love. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. "They'll love it." Would they? I wasn't so sure anymore. A shadow of doubt crossed Ethan's face. He hesitated, glancing toward the window, where the snow continued to fall in soft silence. "Do we have to go?" My heart clenched. For the past few months, he had been asking this question more and more. At first, I thought it was just the usual reluctance of a child not wanting to sit through an evening of boring adult conversation. But then, I started noticing things. The way my mother barely acknowledged him when we visited. The way my father only spoke to him in curt, indifferent tones. The way my siblings' children received expensive gifts, extravagant praise, and boundless affection, while Ethan got polite nods, if anything at all. At 6 years old, my son had begun to understand something no child should ever have to learn. That he was unwanted. I knelt beside him, cupping his small face in my hands. I know it's not always fun, but Christmas is about family, Ethan. And no matter what happens, Dad and I will always be there for you, okay? He nodded slowly, but the spark of excitement in his eyes had dimmed. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Daniel walked into the room, adjusting the cuffs of his navy sweater, his expression unreadable. I knew that look well. He had overheard. And he wasn't happy. We don't have to go, Lauren. His voice was low, careful. Not if it's going to hurt him. I wished it were that simple. You know how they are, I murmured. Skipping Christmas Eve dinner would only make things worse. Worse for who? I didn't say it, but we both knew the answer. For years, I had tried to keep the peace. I had swallowed their passive-aggressive remarks, endured their dismissive glances, ignored the way they looked down on my marriage, on my husband. Because, despite everything, they were still my parents. And a small, foolish part of me still held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, one day they would change. But after this Christmas, I would finally understand. People like my parents don't change. They only break. The Whitmore estate was exactly as I remembered, grand, imposing, and utterly lifeless. The towering Victorian mansion stood like a frozen relic against the snowy landscape, its white stone walls pristine, its iron gate gleaming under the soft glow of lanterns. The moment we pulled into the driveway, I felt the weight settle on my chest. A luxury SUV was already parked in front, Olivia's, of course. My older sister had arrived early, as she always did, eager to bask in my mother's approval. From inside, I could hear the faint hum of classical music, the clinking of crystal glasses, the distant laughter of children. Ethan fidgeted in his seat, his small fingers twisting the hem of his sweater. "Are you sure Santa comes to Grandma and Grandpa's house?" he asked hesitantly. Daniel reached over, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Santa goes wherever you are, buddy. And no matter what happens tonight, you have us. That's all that matters." Ethan nodded, but I could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the car, adjusting my coat against the biting wind. Daniel helped Ethan out, ruffling his hair as they followed me up the grand stone steps. I hesitated for just a moment, my fingers hovering over the door handle. Then, with a steadying breath, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. Warm air enveloped us instantly, carrying the scents of roast turkey, cinnamon, and freshly baked bread. The grand foyer was as breathtaking as ever, the marble floors gleamed under the chandelier's glow, the walls adorned with paintings of ancestors who had built their fortune long before I was even born. At the center of it all stood the crown jewel of my mother's holiday decor, her 12-foot Christmas tree, decorated with Swarovski crystals and gold-trimmed ribbons, standing in perfect contrast to the warmth and simplicity of the tree in our own home. "Jenny, you finally made it," my mother's voice cut through the air, smooth and practiced, as if she were greeting a business associate rather than her own daughter. She emerged from the living room in a pristine white cashmere sweater, pearls glinting at her throat, her expression unreadable. She barely spared a glance at Ethan, offering only a fleeting brush of lips against my cheek before stepping back. "You're late." "Traffic," I lied. Her eyes flickered to Daniel. She didn't even greet him. Not that it surprised me. From the living room, the excited voices of my nieces and nephews rang out. Under the grand Christmas tree, a mountain of presents lay scattered, their colorful ribbons glinting in the soft light. Olivia's twins were already playing with the latest gaming console, Charlotte's daughter sat curled up with a brand new tablet, and Henry's son was gleefully unwrapping what looked like a premium sports gear set. Ethan took a small step closer to me. Then, as if on cue, my father's deep voice boomed from the other room. "Merry Christmas, Patricia." Patricia. Not Lauren. My father still refused to acknowledge my married name. I should have been used to it by now. Ethan stiffened beside me, his small fingers tightening around mine. I squeezed back gently. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered. "Mom and Dad are here for you." Even as I said the words, I felt the gnawing unease curl tighter in my gut. Tonight would be different. Tonight, something was going to break. And by the end of it, my parents would finally learn the cost of their cruelty. The evening unfolded with the kind of forced pleasantries and hollow conversations that had defined every family gathering at the Whitmore estate. The grand dining room was a spectacle of excess, the long mahogany table set with pristine Wedgwood china, polished silverware, and crystal goblets filled with aged wine. Candlelight flickered against the towering floral arrangements, casting soft shadows across the gleaming marble floors. Everything was perfect, meticulously arranged to maintain an illusion of elegance and superiority. But beneath the surface, the tension simmered. Ethan sat quietly beside me, his small frame barely visible against the high-backed dining chair. His cousins chattered excitedly, bragging about their expensive gifts. Olivia's twins boasted about their gaming console, Charlotte's daughter proudly displayed her new tablet, and Henry's son rattled off statistics about his top-of-the-line sports gear. No one asked Ethan what he had gotten for Christmas. No one even acknowledged his presence. My mother sat at the head of the table, watching the conversation unfold with the same satisfaction she always did, as if her carefully curated family was nothing more than a reflection of her own accomplishments. Daniel attempted to engage in small talk, discussing a recent project at work, but my father merely grunted in response before turning his attention to Henry, seamlessly shifting the conversation to stock market trends and investment strategies. It was deliberate, calculated. Daniel might as well have been invisible. I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening around my fork. Ethan, ever observant, noticed. His small fingers curled into his lap, his eyes flickering between his father and grandfather, confusion evident in his expression. The air was thick with unspoken words, each polite exchange laced with condescension. When Ethan, in an innocent attempt to contribute, began telling a story about his school project, my mother lifted a perfectly manicured hand and cut him off mid-sentence. "Let's save the children's chatter for later," she said smoothly, turning back to Olivia's son, who had just begun explaining his latest achievement in competitive chess. Ethan's face fell, his cheeks flushing a deep crimson. I felt something inside me snap. But I swallowed it down. For now. As dinner drew to a close, my mother stood, signaling the beginning of the annual gift exchange. Servants carried in an array of beautifully wrapped presents, setting them beneath the massive Christmas tree in the next room. The grandchildren gathered eagerly, eyes sparkling with anticipation as my mother handed out the gifts. Olivia's children unwrapped brand-new gaming headsets and designer clothing. Charlotte's daughter received a high-end laptop, while Henry's son was given an advanced programming kit. Each child's delight was met with my mother's approving smile, her pride evident as she basked in their gratitude. Finally, she turned to Ethan, holding out a small box. He hesitated for a moment before taking it, his little hands trembling with excitement. He carefully peeled back the glossy wrapping paper, his breath hitching as he lifted the lid. And then, the excitement vanished. His fingers brushed against the bottom of the empty box, his expression shifting from anticipation to confusion. The room was silent. The warmth of the fireplace suddenly felt suffocating. And then my mother laughed. It was soft, almost amused, as if she found the entire situation endearing. "Oh, don't look so disappointed, darling," she said lightly. "He doesn't need anything, does he? Besides, it builds character." Ethan's lower lip trembled. His small fingers curled around the edge of the box as if searching for something, anything, that might have been overlooked. But there was nothing. The weight of humiliation settled over him, sinking into his small frame, crushing the innocent joy that had been there just moments before. A single tear slipped down his cheek, and my heart shattered into a million pieces. Daniel was the first to react. He pushed back his chair, the leg scraping against the polished floor, the sharp sound cutting through the silence. His hands were clenched at his sides, his breathing heavy, controlled only by sheer willpower. I could feel the anger radiating from him, thick and unrelenting. But before he could speak, I placed a hand on his arm. Not yet. I turned back to my mother, meeting her gaze with a calm so chilling it made her smirk falter. Slowly, deliberately, I rose from my seat. Without a word, I reached down and lifted Ethan into my arms, pressing a kiss to his temple. His tiny hands clung to me, his body shaking slightly as he buried his face into my shoulder. "Thank you, Mother," I said, my voice eerily steady. "You've given us exactly what we needed tonight." Her smirk returned, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Oh, I'm sure I have." I smiled. But it wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. It was the quiet kind of smile that preceded a storm. I turned on my heel and walked toward the door, Daniel following closely behind, his silence carrying the same dangerous edge as mine. The room remained frozen, a sea of guilty expressions and whispered breaths. My siblings, Olivia, Charlotte, Henry, shifted in their seats, but none of them spoke. None of them stopped us. As I stepped outside, into the cold winter air, the snow fell in soft, delicate patterns around us. Ethan sniffled against my shoulder, his small body still trembling. Daniel opened the car door, his movements stiff, controlled. As I buckled Ethan into his seat, my son looked up at me, his voice barely above a whisper. Did I do something wrong? The question was a knife straight through my chest. I kept his face, brushing a tear from his cheek. No, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong. Then I looked at Daniel, at the way his jaw was set, at the unspoken fury in his eyes. I turned back toward the Whitmore estate, the grand, perfect mansion glowing behind us like a beacon of falsehood. No, Ethan had done nothing wrong. But my parents had. And they were going to pay. The next morning, the weight of the previous night still hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. The house was eerily quiet except for the faint hum of the heater, the only sound punctuating the silence. I stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, staring out the window as the early morning sun reflected off the untouched snow in our backyard. The night before had played on repeat in my mind, Ethan's crushed expression, my mother's mocking laughter, the suffocating silence that followed. A small shuffle of feet behind me broke my thoughts. Ethan stood in the doorway, his red sweater slightly askew, his eyes still carrying the remnants of last night's pain. Without a word, he climbed onto one of the kitchen stools, resting his chin on the counter. My heart clenched. "Did Santa still come?" he asked softly, his voice fragile, uncertain. Daniel, who had just stepped in, placed a gentle hand on his back. "Santa always comes, buddy." Ethan nodded but said nothing. The damage had already been done. The buzzing of my phone shattered the quiet. I reached for it, and the moment I saw the name on the screen, my stomach twisted. Olivia. I hesitated for only a second before answering. "This is unacceptable," she said the second I picked up. Her voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the undercurrent of anger beneath it. "I'm so sorry, Lauren. I should have said something last night." "I should have." "You didn't," I cut in, my tone sharper than I intended. "None of you did." A pause. Then a sigh. "We were shocked. We didn't expect." I laughed, the sound bitter. "Didn't expect what?" "That she would humiliate my son? That she would take things that far? Don't act like this is new, Olivia. She's been doing this for years." Another pause. Then, softly, "You're right." That caught me off guard. Olivia never admitted when she was wrong. "I talked to Charlotte and Henry," she continued. "We're all furious. And honestly? We've had enough." I narrowed my eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're done," she said, voice firm now. "We talked this morning, and we're cutting them off. Completely." A beat of silence passed. Then another. I leaned against the counter, gripping the phone tighter. "Explain." You know they rely on us, Olivia said matter-of-factly. The investments, the property maintenance, the social connections, everything that keeps them at the top? It's all because of us. We've been the ones making sure their lives run smoothly while they act like they're still untouchable. But after last night? No more. My mind raced. She wasn't wrong. My parents lived under the illusion of wealth, but in reality, their lavish lifestyle was only sustainable because we, their children, had been propping it up. Olivia and her husband covered their medical expenses, ensuring they had access to the best doctors. Charlotte handled all their legal affairs, from estate planning to property contracts. Henry managed their investments, keeping their finances afloat despite my father's increasingly reckless spending. And me? I had been responsible for their real estate dealings, maintaining their home and ensuring they never had to deal with the tedious realities of ownership. We had given them everything. And they had still chosen to tear one of us down. They think they're untouchable, Olivia continued, her voice colder now. Let's see how well they survive without us. A slow, creeping satisfaction spread through me. For the first time in my life, I felt something close to justice. What's the plan? I asked. By the afternoon, the wheels were already in motion. Olivia's first call was to their private physician. I'm sorry, she said in a tone dripping with artificial regret. But I won't be able to continue covering their medical transportation costs. Charlotte's next call was to their property maintenance company. We won't be renewing the contract, she informed them, making sure the notice was immediate. No more landscaping, no more house repairs, no more services that kept their estate in pristine condition. Henry handled the financial side, withdrawing from their investment accounts, effectively severing their access to the discretionary funds that had allowed them to maintain appearances. And me? I made one final call, to their country club. I'd like to cancel the automatic payments, I said smoothly. Effective immediately. The woman on the other end hesitated. Mrs. Whitmore has been a valued member for years. Are you sure? I'm sure. And just like that, the world my parents had built, the carefully crafted facade of power and prestige, began to crumble. The fallout was immediate. Within 24 hours, their world started to shrink. My mother's phone calls went unanswered, her invitations to luncheons ignored. At their next church gathering, the whispers started. People who had once fought for a seat at her table suddenly kept their distance, sensing the shift in power. My father, who had spent years boasting about his financial acumen, found himself struggling to keep up with even the most basic expenses. Without Henry managing their portfolio, poor decisions led to quick and devastating losses. But the biggest blow came when their home began to deteriorate. Without maintenance, small issues became big ones. The once pristine lawn grew wild, the carefully curated rose garden withered. The heating system failed during one of the coldest weeks of winter, and for the first time in decades, my mother had to make calls to contractors herself, calls that were now met with indifference rather than urgency. They had always believed they were above consequences. That no matter how they treated us, we would always be there to support them. They were wrong. And soon, they would feel the full weight of what it meant to be abandoned. Winter had never felt so cruel inside the Whitmore estate. The once pristine mansion now bore the unmistakable signs of neglect, cracks creeping along the marble floors, dust settling in corners where no housekeeper had been to clean, and worst of all, a cold that seeped into the very bones of the house. Without the usual maintenance, the grand estate was no longer the shining beacon of old money and power. It was just another house, stripped of its illusion of invincibility. For the first time in their lives, Charles and Eleanor Whitmore were struggling. Their appointments at Greenwich Hospital had been cancelled. Without Olivia's funding, their VIP status had disappeared overnight. No more personal calls from doctors, no more priority treatments. My mother, who had once prided herself on getting same-day access to specialists that others waited months for, now sat in a crowded waiting room, clutching her designer purse as though it held the last remnants of her dignity. My father, always so composed, had received his first ever declined transaction at the country club, the membership fees suddenly overdue now that Henry had pulled their discretionary funds. The whispers had begun. They had spent decades crafting a life of prestige, carefully curating every detail to maintain their standing. But without the financial and social support of their children, their kingdom was crumbling. The Christmas invitations stopped coming. The friends who once flocked to them at charity galas now barely acknowledged them in public. My mother had tried to salvage the damage, attempting to host one of her infamous luncheons, only to be met with polite refusals and thinly veiled excuses. People could smell desperation. And nothing was more pathetic in their world than a Whitmore who had lost control. And then, just 2 weeks after Christmas, they came to me. It was early morning when the knock echoed through my home. The sound was foreign, unexpected. I wasn't used to visitors, especially not ones like them. I opened the door to find my parents standing there, stripped of their usual armor. My mother's hair, always perfectly styled, was slightly out of place, the first sign of her unraveling. My father's expensive cashmere coat looked worn, as though he had been wearing it far more frequently than before. But it was their eyes that caught me off guard, tired, weary, and for the first time, uncertain. "Lauren," my father started, his voice measured, cautious. "We need to talk." I didn't step aside immediately. For so long, they had expected me to come to them. They had expected that no matter what they did, I would always return, always seek their approval. Now, they were here, at my doorstep, looking at me as though I was their last hope. "Come in," I said finally, my tone giving nothing away. They stepped inside, my father scanning the room as if seeing my home for the first time, as if realizing that despite not having their wealth, I had built something real. Daniel sat at the dining table, watching them with unreadable eyes. Ethan was upstairs, still asleep, unaware that the very people who had humiliated him were now standing in our living room. My mother cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Lauren, we've had a difficult few weeks." I said nothing. "We've run into some challenges," my father continued, and for the first time, I saw it, the hesitation, the fragility beneath his usually unshakable demeanor. The great Charles Whitmore, struggling to admit weakness. "Challenges?" I echoed, arching an eyebrow. "You mean the hospital appointments you can't get? The country club membership you can't afford? The house falling apart without someone to maintain it?" My mother flinched, just barely. "It's not just that," she murmured, her voice quieter now. "People are talking." Ah. There it was. It wasn't just about the money, or the inconvenience. It was about the loss of status. "You mean your friends have abandoned you?" I tilted my head, my voice carefully neutral. "Now that you're no longer the Queen of Greenwich Society?" Silence. "Lauren, we know we've made mistakes," my father finally said, his tone heavier than before. "We? Mistakes?" The word came out sharper than I intended. I took a step forward, folding my arms. "You humiliated my son. On Christmas. You deliberately singled out a 6-year-old to make a point. And now that the consequences are hitting you, now you want to talk?" My mother's lips parted slightly, as if she had been expecting something different, as if she thought I would immediately soften, that I would fall back into the role of the daughter who always sought their approval. But I didn't. I saw the flicker of something on my father's face then, not just guilt, but regret. Real, painful regret. "We were wrong," he said, and this time, his voice wasn't measured or rehearsed. It was raw. "We let our pride blind us to what truly mattered." My mother remained silent. Her fingers clutched the hem of her coat, a gesture that, in anyone else, would have been a sign of vulnerability. But in her? It was a sign of struggle. "We built our lives around status," my father continued. "And we forgot that none of it meant anything if we lost our family." A long silence stretched between us. Then, from the stairs, a small voice. "Grandma?" We all turned. Ethan stood at the top of the staircase, his little hands gripping the railing, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He had clearly woken up midway through the conversation, and I wondered how much he had heard. My mother stiffened. Her entire body tensed, as if she had been caught off guard. Then Ethan asked the question that shattered everything. "Why don't you like me?" The room turned to ice. My mother's breath hitched. For the first time, true, genuine pain crossed her face. Not the kind put on for show, not the kind meant to manipulate, but real, deep-rooted pain. Her voice broke. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Ethan." My son tilted his head, considering this. Then, in the simple, unburdened way that only children could, he stepped down the stairs and walked toward her. "It's okay," he said softly. "I have my red sweater. If you're cold, I can let you borrow it." And just like that, the woman who had spent her entire life holding on to power crumbled. Tears slipped past the carefully crafted walls she had built around herself, streaking down her face, smudging the perfect makeup she always wore like armor. My father placed a hand on her shoulder, his own expression heavy. "Would you give us a chance?" my father asked, his voice unsteady. I looked at Daniel, who simply nodded, trusting me to make the decision. I turned back to them. "If you want a second chance," I said, my voice steady, "there will be conditions. Because this time it wouldn't be on their terms. It would be on mine." For the first time in their lives, my parents weren't the ones dictating the rules. The power dynamic had shifted, and they knew it. My mother, who had spent years wielding control like a finely honed blade, sat frozen, her carefully curated composure slipping with each passing second. My father, once the untouchable patriarch of the Whitmore family, merely nodded, his silence a quiet admission of defeat. "Conditions?" my mother finally asked, her voice hoarse, as if the very act of speaking those words burned her throat. I leaned against the dining table, arms crossed, studying them. "Yes. If you truly want to be part of this family again, you don't just get to waltz back in when it's convenient for you. Things will be different." My mother opened her mouth, most likely to argue, but I held up a hand, stopping her. "First, there will be no more judgment. No more subtle insults, no more comparing Ethan to his cousins, no more treating Daniel like an outsider. If you can't respect my family, you have no place in it." My father nodded immediately, his expression tired but accepting. My mother hesitated, lips pressed tightly together, but after a long pause, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Second," I continued, "this relationship will not be one-sided. If you want to rebuild what you've broken, you have to put in the effort. That means showing up, not just for appearances, but because you genuinely care." My mother exhaled slowly, her hands clenching around the hem of her coat. "And what does that mean, exactly?" "It means no more grand gestures for the sake of reputation. No more charity events where you pretend to be the perfect mother and grandmother. If you want to see Ethan, you do it because you love him, not because you need to maintain an image." Something flickered in my mother's eyes. Guilt. Regret. The slow, painful realization that the world she had built was nothing more than a house of cards, and it had finally collapsed. "And finally," I said, voice steady, "you are no longer entitled to our support. Financially, socially, or otherwise. You'll stand on your own 2 feet. If you need help, you ask. But you do not expect it." My mother's head snapped up at that, her posture going rigid. That was the one thing she hadn't expected. Losing control over her children had been one thing. Losing the life of luxury she had become accustomed to? That was another entirely. "Lauren, be reasonable." "I am," I cut in sharply. "You have no idea how reasonable I'm being right now." A heavy silence settled over the room. My mother glanced at my father, as if searching for support, but he didn't argue. He just exhaled a deep breath and said, "We understand." Those 2 words sealed it. For the first time in their lives, Charles and Eleanor Whitmore had to start over. 3 months passed, and with them, the last remnants of my parents' once untouchable status. Their names no longer held weight in Greenwich's elite circles. Their invitations to high society events had long since dried up. The country club, which had once been their second home, had removed them from its membership roster. And without the silent financial backing of their children, they were forced to confront the realities of their situation. The grand Whitmore estate, once the symbol of their power, had lost its luster. Without weekly maintenance, the once flawless garden had begun to grow wild, the perfectly manicured rose bushes now tangled with weeds. Inside, the once gleaming floors bore the scuffs of age, the grand chandelier now slightly dimmer without the meticulous upkeep of a full-time staff. The illusion of wealth had crumbled, leaving behind nothing but the bare bones of what once was. And yet, for the first time, they were learning how to live. My father, who had spent his entire life obsessing over wealth and prestige, had taken on a role as a volunteer bookkeeper at the local senior center. It wasn't paid. It wasn't glamorous. But there was something almost peaceful about the way he approached it now, his once meticulously styled hair now slightly unkempt, his designer suits replaced with more practical sweaters and slacks. My mother, once the queen of Greenwich's social scene, had been forced to step away from the world that had abandoned her. Instead of charity galas and country club luncheons, she now spent her afternoons at a small book club, a quiet gathering of women who didn't care about last names or bank accounts. For the first time, she was experiencing what it meant to have relationships not built on status, but on connection. I never knew conversations could feel this real, she had admitted once, almost reluctantly, as she helped me set the dinner table one Saturday evening. That was another change. They no longer hosted family gatherings at their mansion. Now, they came to ours. Every Saturday, without fail, they arrived, not as hosts, not as figures of power, but as family. And Ethan? He had begun to smile around them again. "Grandpa, did you see my game?" he asked excitedly one evening after his little league practice, running up to my father with all the enthusiasm he had once reserved only for Daniel and me. My father, the same man who had once dismissed Ethan's very existence, knelt down, ruffling his hair. "Of course I did, champ. You were incredible out there." "And my mother?" She had started helping him with his homework, sitting beside him at the kitchen table, patiently working through math problems in a way that was so foreign, so different from the woman she had once been, that sometimes I wondered if this was the same person who had humiliated my son on Christmas Eve. Maybe she had changed. Or maybe she had simply learned what truly mattered. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, I caught a glimpse of them outside. Ethan was in the garden, showing my parents how to care for the plants, his tiny hands demonstrating how to loosen the soil, how to water the flowers just right. My mother, her once perfectly manicured nails now covered in dirt, listened intently. My father, who had once scoffed at anything that wasn't related to finance or power, watched with a quiet reverence. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, leaning against the counter. Daniel stepped up beside me, following my gaze. "Did you ever think we'd see this day?" I exhaled a slow breath. "No. But I think, maybe it's enough." Daniel wrapped an arm around me, pressing a kiss to my temple. Outside, Ethan laughed as my mother accidentally knocked over a watering can, her gasp of surprise followed by a genuine, uninhibited laugh of her own. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real gift this year. The box my mother had once given my son had been empty. But now, it was full. Full of lessons learned. Full of the kind of love that money could never buy.